like to take a look now at how the president does his job. And the job of the president is a very unique job in that the president wears many hats. We're going to take a look at what the Constitution says about the president. And what we need to realize is that the Constitution says that the president will do many things. For example, he is the chief executive. He's the head of state. He's the commander-in-chief. He does many things. And when somebody tries to do many jobs, it will sometimes, many times, lead to problems in effectively doing the jobs that he's asked to do. So let's take a look first at what the Constitution says about the president. Again, as with everything that the Constitution addresses, the Constitution does not go into a whole lot of detail. Article 2 of the Constitution is known as the Executive Article, and it explains the basic requirements to be president. You must be a natural-born citizen, which means you have to have been born a citizen of the United States. You must be at least 35 years old, and you must have lived in the United States for the previous 14 years. And it also says that the president will serve a 4-year term. Now, what you will notice is that the Constitution does not say anything about how many terms the president can serve consecutively, or how many terms can the president serve in total. Originally, the Constitution did not put any limits on how many terms the president can serve. What we have is we have the 22nd Amendment in 1951, which limits any president to 2 terms or 10 years. And what that means is, if a president is elected to 2 terms, that means he can serve 8 years. But if the vice president gets elevated to president, then that person can serve a total of 10 years. If the president dies before his first 2 years of office is over, the vice president takes over for 2.5 years. Then the vice president could only be elected one more time. That vice president would serve a total of 7 years. If the president dies with less than 2 years in office, and the vice president takes over, then the vice president would serve the last 1.5 years of the president's term. Then the vice president could be then elected to 2 terms, because 4 years for the first term, 4 years for the second term, 1.5 years for the term of the previous president only equals 9.5. So in that case, he could be elected twice as president and fill less than half of the president's remaining term. That was done by Constitutional Amendment in 1951, basically in response to FDR being elected 4 times. And then the only other major constitutional change in dealing with the president is the 25th Amendment, which was passed in 1967, which basically talks about what happens if the president becomes disabled. Because the Constitution talks about what happens if the president dies. It doesn't talk about anything about a president being disabled while in office. Again, a response, I believe, to FDR. And then the 25th Amendment also talks about filling the vice presidential vacancies. Prior to 1967, if the vice president became president, the vice presidency just remained empty. Or if the vice president died or stepped down, the vice presidency would just remain vacant. Starting in 1967, the Constitution provides the direction on how to fill a vice presidential vacancy if somebody resigns or quits. And that was pretty prophetic because just, less than 7 years later, Spiro Agnew, the vice president under Richard Nixon, would step down. And Richard Nixon appointed Gerald Ford to be the new vice president. And then just shortly after Gerald Ford became vice president, Richard Nixon stepped down as president. Gerald Ford became president. So it was quite prophetic that this amendment would be passed so close to the whole Watergate situation and the need to replace the vice president twice in a very short period of time. As I said earlier, the job of the president can be very difficult because a lot of times when the president is fulfilling one of his obligations as president, it sometimes conflicts with one of the other obligations he may have as president. And when the president is trying to make a decision or weighing his options, those choices aren't as clear as they look sometimes. We as citizens a lot of times will look at the way a president acts and we won't understand why he's doing that. But as we look closer at what the president is dealing with as president, we will maybe gain a closer insight into why the president does certain things. And the way I try to explain this and try and demonstrate this to students is I use the phrase dichotomies. The presidency is made up of a whole series of dichotomies. And what a dichotomy is, or when something is dichotomous, what it means is it's divided or dividing into two parts or classifications. Deciding which direction we're going to go, left or right, is kind of a dichotomous situation. Deciding whether we're going to move the picture up or down is kind of a dichotomous decision. Dichotomies mean two. So when the president is making certain decisions, he is almost always dealing with competing interests. If he decides to veto a bill, he's dealing with part of the country who likes the bill. He's also dealing with part of the country who doesn't like the bill. When the president is looking to appoint somebody to be a new Supreme Court justice, part of the country wants certain things in the Supreme Court justice, the other part of the country wants something else. So when the president is fulfilling his duties, he's constantly being faced with these situations where he has to make a decision where basically he's going to be upsetting a group of people regardless of which decision he makes. And over the next couple of slides, we're going to give you some examples of some of the dichotomies that the president faces. Now, this is not all of them, but what we're trying to do is trying to give you an overall view of some of the responsibilities the president has and how the president really doesn't have very many easy decisions during his term in office. And the very first dichotomy we want to look at is the idea of presidential authority versus presidential power. When we look at the Constitution, it says that the president has certain authorities. There's certain things the president can do. But if we look at the things that George Washington and Adams and even Herbert Hoover did as president, it's much different than the things that George Bush did. And the reason for that is that, or the Constitution is very limited on specific things they say the president can do. But a lot of times, presidents will do things just simply because they're allowed. If you let somebody do something, even though they don't have the authority to do it, it can very quickly become a power that they possess. If you allow somebody to come into your house and take money from your safe, you let them do it 2 or 3 times, eventually they're going to say, hey, he's let me do it all these times, so I must have the right to do it. That's what happened with the president. And I'll give you a really good example. Today the president does certain things that the Constitution does not necessarily give them the right to do or the authority to do. For example, your textbook and many textbooks call the president one of the country's chief legislators. And what a legislator is a person who makes legislation. The Constitution does not give the president the right or the power or the authority to introduce a piece of legislation into Congress. But George Washington, sometime during his term of office, had an idea for a piece of legislation. He had somebody write it up, and he, George Washington, took it to some member of Congress and asked that member of Congress to introduce this bill on my behalf. That member of Congress could have said no, or Congress could have said no when that legislator tried to do it. But Congress allowed that legislator to introduce that piece of legislation on behalf of the president. And therefore, every president since George Washington has believed that they had the right, the power, to have somebody introduce legislation on their behalf. When we take a look at the power of the president, you have to understand something. That presidential power is cumulative. What that means is if we look at the presidential power before FDR, it was pretty limited by the Constitution. Presidents generally did what the Constitution said they could do. When we get FDR elected, we'll see that presidential power expands under FDR because FDR starts doing things that no other president ever tried to do. Well, once the Supreme Court and Congress and the American people let FDR start to expand the powers of the president and start to do more things, then every other president after FDR assumes he can do everything that FDR was allowed to do, and every president since FDR, and then they accumulate power on their own. So what happens is presidential power is cumulative. Presidents have become much more powerful today, not because the Constitution has been amended to give them more power. Presidents simply have become more powerful just because we as the American people have allowed them to do certain things. So there's a major difference between presidential authority, what the Constitution says the president can do, and what the president is allowed to do. And as president, I'm weighing that. If there's something that I think Congress and the people will let me do, but I don't know if it's something the Constitution originally wanted me to do, I've got to weigh that out. What do I as a president think is more important? My ability to do something I think needs to be done, so I take advantage of the fact that people will let me do it? Or do I think it's really important to maintain the limits of the president according to the Constitution? It's a difficult situation for the president to be in, power versus authority. Another dichotomy, which is very closely related to this, is this very interesting look at the office of the presidency versus the office holder, or who the current president is. When we look at the presidency, if we were to study the presidency, we couldn't just study what the Constitution says about the presidency, because the Constitution just explains what the office of the presidency should be about. If we wanted to truly understand the presidency, we would have to study both what the Constitution says and every single president that we've had. 40-some-odd presidents would have to study, because each president brings something new to the office. The office of the presidency changes just a little bit with each president. Now, we need to understand that there is the respect and the authority that the office holds, and that respect and authority doesn't always flow over to the office holder. When we look at the presidents, some presidents were very popular because of their personality, and some were not. I have a very good friend of mine whose daughter worked in the White House with President Bill Clinton. This friend of mine despised Bill Clinton, didn't like Bill Clinton, but when he went to visit his daughter in Washington, D.C., one of the first things he asked his daughter to do is set up a meeting where he could meet the president. And he didn't say, I want to meet Bill Clinton. He said, I'd like to meet the president. So we have this respect and feeling of adoration for the office of president. The men don't always receive that same respect or adoration that we give to the office. When looking at the office versus the office holder, we have to understand that the personality of the man in office is very, very, very impactful on how successful that president will be. As a matter of fact, when the scholars, presidential scholars, do research into presidents, they have to look at two different things. They have to look at the authority that the president commanded while he was in office, and they have to look at the power that the president commanded. And most presidential scholars will tell you the most important thing in evaluating a president's term in office is how was he able to use his power. Much less about how was he able to use the authority, because authority doesn't necessarily change from president to president. And a perfect example of that would be President Herbert Hoover, served from 29 to 1932. He's what we call a Whig president. And Herbert Hoover is blamed for the Great Depression. And we talked about this. And the reason he's blamed for the Great Depression is not that he caused it, but Herbert Hoover believed that the president should only do what the Constitution says the president can do. He was a Whig president. That was his view, his perspective on his powers. And most presidents before Herbert Hoover were also very much Whig presidents. But in 1933, we elect FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is more of what we call a steward president. And FDR was just the opposite. FDR said, I'm going to do whatever I can as president as long as the Constitution doesn't say I can't do it. Two very different perspectives on presidential power. Same exact Constitution told Herbert Hoover what his authorities were, and that same document told FDR what his authorities were. But the difference was that FDR took advantage of the power of the presidency. He took advantage of the fact that we were in a crisis, the Great Depression, and he expanded his personal powers and therefore also expanded the powers of the presidency.